Let's get started, shall we? Today we are taking a deep dive into The How of Happiness, the book by Sonja Lyubomirsky.
Ah, a classic.
Oh, it really is. And it's so practical. It really digs into the science of happiness and gives us some,
Actionable steps.
yes, exactly, actionable steps that we can take to kind of boost our happiness. And what I found really fascinating, and I think this is a great place to start, is this idea that 40%
Well, wow.
of our happiness is actually,
Within our control.
yes, within our control. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
When you think about it, like, we often think happiness is this elusive thing that's based on, luck or circumstance. But she's saying that a large chunk of it is actually something we can influence.
Right. And I think that's what's so empowering about her work, right? It's like she's not just saying, oh, some people are born happy and some people aren't. She's saying, no, like there's this whole area where you can actually learn
It's
skills.
a skill.
Yeah, it's like learning to play an instrument or learning a new language. You can actually learn how to be happier.
So that's kind of what we're going to be exploring today, the how of happiness. Like, what are those skills? What are those things that we can do? But before we jump into the specifics, I think it's helpful to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit. So, she talks about this idea of the happiness set point, right?
Yeah, so the happiness set point is basically like, think of it like a thermostat. We all have this kind of baseline level of happiness that we tend to return to, even after, big events happen in our lives, whether they're positive or negative.
So like winning the lottery or
Yeah.
or like a really difficult breakup or something.
So you might get this temporary spike or dip in your happiness, but eventually you tend to go back to that kind of set point. And the interesting thing is that while 50% of that set point is determined by our genes, like our genetic makeup, 10%
That's
is
circumstances.
circumstances, exactly. So things like how much money you make, your job, your relationships, that kind of thing. But that leaves 40% for intentional activities.
And that's what we're talking about, that 40%.
Yeah, that's the exciting part, right? That's where we have some agency.
So let's dive into some of those intentional activities, those happiness activities that Lyubomirsky outlines in the book. And there are 12 of them, which is a lot, so we're not going to get to all of them today. But we're going to highlight some of the ones that I think are really interesting and maybe have some surprising benefits. So where should we start? What jumps out to you?
Well, one that I think is really interesting, and maybe not what people think of right away when they think of happiness, is cultivating optimism.
Yeah.
And, this isn't about being like, Pollyanna-ish and just thinking everything's going to be perfect all the time, but it's more about having that kind of hopeful outlook and being able to see the good even when things are tough.
Right. It's like, it's not about denying reality, but it's about kind of approaching challenges with a more positive mindset.
Exactly. And then there's a lot of research that shows that optimism is linked to, motor physical health, better mental health, greater resilience, just kind of helps us cope with life's ups and downs better.
So how do we cultivate optimism? Like, I can see how it would be beneficial, but life throws curveballs.
Yeah.
How do we train ourselves to be more optimistic?
Well, one of the techniques that Lyubomirsky talks about is called best possible self. And this is kind of a fun exercise where you actually sit down and you write out or you imagine this future version of yourself where you've achieved your goals, you're living your best life.
Like your ideal self.
Yeah, exactly. And you really go into detail, like what does your day look like? What kind of relationships do you have? What kind of work are you doing? And by doing this, it actually kind of shifts your thinking patterns and starts to kind of create these more positive neural pathways in your brain.
It's almost like giving yourself a positive roadmap, right?
Yeah.
Like, here's where I want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what I want to achieve.
Yeah.
And it helps you kind of, stay focused on that even when things are tough.
Right. And even if you don't achieve all of those things, just the act of kind of visualizing it and thinking about it can actually boost your optimism levels.
I love that. All right, so we've got optimism. What about some of the other activities? I know a lot of people are curious about gratitude, right? Like, that's a big one that we hear a lot about these days. Why is gratitude so powerful?
Yeah, gratitude is really a game changer. And it's so simple, right? It's just about noticing and appreciating the good things in your life, big or small. But what happens is that when we start to focus on what we're grateful for, it actually shifts our attention away from the negative, which we tend to kind of dwell on naturally. And there's a ton of research that shows that people who regularly practice gratitude, they report higher levels of happiness, they have stronger relationships, they're even more resilient in the face of stress.
I remember reading about a study where they had participants keep a gratitude journal. And they found that not only did they feel happier, but they actually reported fewer physical aches and pains.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, like it's really, it's mind-body connection, right?
It is. And, gratitude doesn't have to be this big formal thing. It can be as simple as, at the end of the day, just thinking of 3 things you're grateful for.
Or even just like, savoring a cup of coffee in the morning, like really appreciating the taste, the smell, the warmth.
Exactly. Or like, taking a moment to appreciate a beautiful sunset or a kind gesture from a stranger. It's really about those little moments.
Yeah. It's about being present and noticing the good.
Absolutely. And that actually brings us to another important concept that Lyubomirsky talks about, which is hedonic adaptation. So this is the tendency we have to kind of get used to things over time, both good and bad.
Oh, like when you buy a new car and you're so excited about it at first, but then after a while, it just becomes your car.
Exactly.
It fades.
Yeah. And the same thing can happen with positive experiences. We get used to them, and that happiness boost we get initially, it kind of wears off. But Lyubomirsky provides us with some tools, some strategies for combating this hedonic adaptation.
Yeah. Like how do we hold on to that happiness, that joy?
Well, one of the things she talks about is savoring, which we just touched on a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's really about consciously appreciating and extending those positive experiences.
So it's like instead of just, gulping down your coffee, you really take the time to smell it, to taste it, to really experience it fully.
Exactly. And you can do that with anything, right? Like a beautiful piece of music, a conversation with a loved one. It's about really being present in that moment and soaking it all in.
And imagine that kind of helps to create a more lasting memory of that experience, right? Like it's not just fleeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And another key strategy is variety. So, shaking things up, trying new things, getting out of your comfort zone, that can really help prevent us from getting stuck in a rut and keep life feeling fresh and exciting.
So it's like if you always order the same thing at your favorite restaurant, maybe try something different next time.
Exactly. Or, if you've always wanted to learn a new language or take up a new hobby, now is the time.
Yeah. Just do something different, break out of that routine.
And I think it's important to remember that happiness is not this destination that we arrive at and then we're done. It's really an ongoing journey, right? There are going to be ups and downs. There are going to be challenges. But by incorporating these practices and these strategies into our lives, we can cultivate a more consistent and fulfilling sense of happiness.
I love that. It's like instead of chasing happiness, we're cultivating it, we're creating it.
Yeah,
It's about those daily choices and those habits that we build.
absolutely.
And I think it's also important to remember that happiness is contagious, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like when we're happier, we tend to bring other people up with us.
Yeah. It's like a ripple effect.
And I think that's a really beautiful thing to keep in mind, right? Like as we're working on our own happiness, we're also contributing to the happiness of those around us.
And that in itself can boost our own happiness, right? Like knowing that we're having a positive impact on others.
It's a win-win. So as we wrap up here, I just want to say, I think it's so empowering to realize that we have more control over our happiness than we might think. It's not about waiting for good things to happen. It's about actively creating them.
And even if you just start with one small thing, like practicing gratitude for 5 minutes a day, or trying that best possible self-exercise, you might be surprised at the difference it can make.
So,
Yeah.
so for our listeners out there, I would love for you to think about, what's one thing that you can do today to kind of boost your happiness levels? What's one small step you can take and see what happens? Experiment with it. And remember, like happiness is a journey, not a destination. So just keep exploring, keep learning, and keep growing.
And remember, you're not alone on this journey. There are so many resources out there, like Sonja Lyubomirsky's book, and communities of people who are all striving for the same thing, which is to live happier, more fulfilling lives.
So true. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into happiness. And until next time, keep those happiness vibes flowing.
Absolutely.
Bye.